My fiancé told me I'm not really American because my parents immigrated, even though I was born here. It blew up when he said you Indians versus us whites to his parents. I, Maya, 26 female, and my fiancé, Jamie, 28 male, recently said something that's made me question our upcoming wedding in December. We've been together for 3 years. My background is pretty straightforward. My parents moved here from India before I was born. My older brother, younger sister, and I were all born and raised in Chicago. We grew up American. I went to India only once, when I was about 9, mainly to see my grandparents and some aunts and uncles. I remember parts of it, the heat, the crowds, the unfamiliar food, but it feels like a lifetime ago. I don't speak Hindi or Punjabi, maybe just a few words my parents use around the house sometimes. My parents, Mr. and Mrs. Sharma, worked hard to build a life here. They kept some traditions, mostly around food. My mom, Lena, makes amazing butter chicken and dal, but they also embraced American life fully. Mom learned to make lasagna and chili. Dad, Raj, got really into baseball. They encouraged us kids to join school clubs and sports, not just stick with other Indian families. My dad used to say he saw too many people limit their world by only staying within their own community. I remember joining the school newspaper staff in high school, while some other Indian kids I knew were only part of the South Asian Students Association. My parents were proud I was branching out. They bought us McDonald's sometimes, let us go to sleepovers, things some of my cousins weren't allowed to do. I met Jamie through mutual friends 3 years ago at a summer barbecue. He works in finance, I work in marketing. What struck me about him initially was how normal he was about my background. He asked where my family was from, I told him India, and that was pretty much it. No weird questions about karma or arranged marriages, no comments about how exotic I looked. It felt good after dating a guy in college who kept trying to get me to wear a sari he bought online. Jamie seemed genuinely interested in me, not some idea of an Indian woman. We talked about our families. He knew my parents immigrated but that my siblings and I were born here. His own grandparents came from Germany and Ireland, something he mentioned casually once when we were looking at old photos at his parents' house. He proposed about 6 months ago, on a weekend trip to Lake Geneva. It was lovely, and we started planning a wedding for December. Everything seemed fine until last month. We were discussing venues, and I mentioned liking a particular hotel ballroom downtown. Jamie asked if we were planning an American wedding or an Indian one, or maybe both. I told him just an American one. I explained that I wouldn't even know where to start with planning an Indian wedding, and my family wasn't traditional in that way, so they wouldn't expect it. Jamie looked genuinely surprised. He tilted his head and asked why not, considering I'm Indian, he thought we'd incorporate that. I tried to make light of it. I pointed towards a decorative beer stein on his bookshelf, a souvenir from his parents' trip to Germany. I asked if that meant we should have a polka band and serve bratwurst at the wedding, maybe he could wear lederhosen. He looked completely confused and said no, of course not. I replied that it felt like the same thing. His family came from Germany and Ireland, mine from India, but we were both born and raised here, making us both American. He shifted in his seat. He said, yeah, but it's not quite the same. You're Indian American. That phrasing stopped me. I asked him why the distinction. Why wasn't he calling himself German American or Irish American? He didn't have a clear answer. He started talking vaguely about how my cultural background was more visible or distinct, but he couldn't really articulate it. The more I asked why he got to be just American while I needed a hyphen, the more flustered he seemed. We didn't resolve it, the conversation just fizzled out, and we moved on to talking about the guest list. I pushed it aside, figuring it was a one-off awkward moment. But it came up again last week. We were having dinner at his parents' house. His mom, Carol Peterson, was asking about wedding details. She mentioned something about colorful fabrics and asked if I'd be wearing a traditional red outfit for any part of the celebration. I politely explained again that we were planning a standard American wedding, and my parents were completely fine with that. Then Jamie chimed in, looking at his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Peterson. He said, it's kind of a shame, though. You Indians have such vibrant weddings, much more exciting than ours. He gestured between himself and his parents. I put my glass down. I asked him directly what he meant by you Indians and ours, because I was also American, born and raised here just like him. He looked flustered again, glancing at his parents. He replied, well, you know. You're Indian, we're white. His parents didn't say anything, just looked down at their plates. The rest of the dinner felt stiff. I didn't say much. Driving home, the car was quiet. The comment stayed with me. It wasn't just about the wedding anymore. What happens when we have children? Kids born here, in America. Will their own father constantly differentiate them, remind them that because they look a certain way, they aren't fully American in his eyes? People outside the family might say ignorant things, that's almost expected sometimes, but the idea that this distinction could come from within our own home, from their dad. It felt wrong. I don't want my kids navigating the same feeling I get when someone insists on labeling me Indian American just because of my appearance or last name, implying I'm somehow less American than someone whose ancestors came from Europe a few generations ago. I understand my heritage. My parents are from India. But my life, my experiences, my identity, they were formed here. I don't feel connected to India in a way that defines my daily life or my sense of self. Being constantly expected to represent or perform a culture I barely know firsthand is exhausting. This whole situation has me second-guessing the wedding. Am I making too big a deal out of this? Or are these valid concerns? I need to talk to Jamie about it, but I don't know how to bring it up without sounding accusatory or just reopening the same unresolved argument. I don't want to live my life feeling like I have to constantly justify my American identity, especially not to my own husband. Update 1. Thank you to everyone who read my post and shared their thoughts. The sheer volume of responses was unexpected. Reading through them all took time, but it helped clarify things in my own mind. Many people shared similar experiences or pointed out nuances I hadn't fully considered. I decided I couldn't let this simmer. I sent Jamie a text while he was still at work, asking if he was free to talk seriously when he got home. He agreed and came straight back from the office. We sat down on the couch in our living room. It felt a bit formal. I started by telling him how much our relationship meant to me, how much I valued the past 3 years, and how he was different from other guys I'd dated because he hadn't initially made my background a thing. Then I brought up the dinner at his parents' place. I explained, as calmly as I could, how his comment about you Indians and us Americans/white people landed. I told him that for 3 years, he'd never made me feel like an outsider in our relationship, so hearing him draw that line was jarring. I tried to explain what it's like for many people of color in the US, even those born here, how there's often an external pressure or expectation to perform your ancestral culture, even if you don't personally connect with it deeply. I talked about growing up here, identifying primarily as American, and the frustration of constantly having my identity questioned or hyphenated solely based on my appearance or family origin. I pointed out the double standard. No one insists he call himself German American or expects him to maintain specific German or Irish traditions to be considered fully American. His European ancestry is just accepted as part of the American tapestry, while my Indian ancestry is often treated as something that makes me separate or other. I mentioned how some online comments even suggested I was somehow ashamed of my heritage simply because I don't actively practice many Indian traditions or identify strongly with the culture. I asked him if anyone would accuse him of being ashamed of his German roots because he doesn't wear lederhosen or speak German. Why does that burden of cultural representation fall disproportionately on people who aren't white? It creates unnecessary hurdles for integration when people are constantly being pushed to emphasize differences rather than shared nationality. Jamie listened quietly. At first, he looked defensive, maybe a bit confused. But as I talked, I saw something shift in his expression. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking down at his hands. Then he looked at me and apologized. He said he hadn't realized how his words came across or the implications behind them. He admitted that he'd never really thought critically about it before, how white is often treated as the default American, while everyone else gets a qualifier. He acknowledged growing up with that implicit bias without ever examining it. He said hearing it spelled out, and understanding how it made me feel coming from him, made him see it differently. We talked for a long time, nearly 2 hours. We discussed the attitudes he grew up with, the casual ways race and identity were talked about, or often not talked about. He said he genuinely didn't intend to make me feel othered, but he understood now why his comments did exactly that. He realized his surprise about the wedding wasn't just curiosity, it was rooted in an assumption based on my background. He said he wasn't trying to push for a Bollywood wedding, as some might assume, but was just trying to acknowledge my heritage, yet he understood now that his way of doing it was clumsy and based on stereotypes. He promised he wouldn't make assumptions like that again or use that kind of language. We talked about future children. We both agreed we want to raise them as American, first and foremost. If, down the line, they develop an interest in exploring their Indian, German, or Irish heritage, that's entirely up to them, something we could support them in exploring if they choose it. But their primary identity, rooted in their birthplace and upbringing, would be American, without hyphens imposed by us. Jamie stated clearly he never wanted our kids to feel the way he made me feel. He also agreed that people should define their own identity. He wouldn't be assigning hyphens to anyone anymore. He seemed sincere, and I could see he was taking it seriously, not just saying things to smooth things over. I added, trying to lighten the mood a little at the end, that he shouldn't expect me to suddenly start making roti every day just because we had this conversation. He laughed and agreed. We acknowledged this probably wouldn't be our last conversation about race, identity, or cultural differences, but we agreed not to sweep things under the rug again. We need to communicate openly when these issues arise. So, the wedding is still on for December. The conversation was difficult, but necessary. It felt like we cleared a significant hurdle. Update 2. It's been about 6 weeks since the big talk with Jamie. Wedding planning has continued, mostly smoothly, but we hit another related bump, though we handled it much differently this time. We were finalizing our vendor list. We'd previously talked about hiring a specific local band we both loved after seeing them at a friend's wedding last year. They play a mix of classic rock, pop, and funk, perfect for getting everyone dancing. We had tentatively penciled them in. Last week, Jamie came home from work and mentioned a conversation he'd had with his colleague, Dave. Dave's cousin is apparently a DJ who does weddings and events, specializing in a mix of top 40 and Bhangra/Bollywood music. Jamie suggested, maybe we should consider hiring him instead. He said Dave mentioned the cousin was really good at reading the crowd and could add some unique flavor to the reception. I paused, looking up from the caterer quotes I was reviewing. I asked Jamie why he was bringing this up now, when we'd both been excited about the band. He hesitated for a second, then said he thought it might be a nice way to acknowledge my family's background, maybe get my relatives onto the dance floor with something familiar. Instead of reacting defensively, I took a breath and referred back to our previous conversation. I reminded him gently that my family, like me, was pretty Americanized. While some older relatives might know Bhangra, most of my cousins, siblings, and parents would be just as happy dancing to Bruno Mars or Stevie Wonder as anyone else. More importantly, I didn't particularly want a Bhangra DJ. The band felt more like us as a couple. I pointed out that suggesting the Indian DJ, right after our talk about him making assumptions based on my background, felt like he was falling back into that pattern, even if his intention was good. This time, Jamie didn't get flustered or defensive. He looked thoughtful, nodded slowly, and then said, "You're right. I see what you mean. I was thinking about including your side, but I defaulted to a stereotype again, didn't I? Sorry. The band is who we both wanted. Let's stick with the band." It was a much shorter, calmer conversation. He recognized the pattern himself once I pointed it out. It felt like progress. He wasn't just repeating apologies, he was actively trying to apply what we'd discussed. Later that week, we had dinner with my parents. My mom asked about the planning, and I mentioned we'd booked the band we liked. My dad joked, "Good, none of that loud Bhangra music. I want to hear some Eagles." My mom laughed and added she was looking forward to dancing with Jamie's dad, probably to something like Motown. They asked if Jamie's parents were okay with a non-church wedding. We're having a secular ceremony at the hotel. We confirmed they were fine. My parents' main concern seemed to be making sure everyone had a good time and that the food was decent. They offered to host a small pre-wedding dinner for close family, maybe order some good Indian takeout for that, alongside pizza and salad, a typical Sharma family gathering. It was another small reinforcement that my family's expectations aligned with mine, not with the assumptions Jamie had initially made. It was helpful for Jamie to hear that directly from them too. Update 3. With the wedding getting closer, just over 2 months away now, Jamie and I decided to do a short premarital counseling workshop. It wasn't because of any major crisis, but more because our earlier conflict highlighted that we hadn't really discussed certain expectations and backgrounds in depth. We both felt it would be a good idea to have some tools for communication, especially since we come from slightly different contexts, even if we are both American. We found a weekend workshop focused on communication, finances, and navigating family dynamics for engaged couples. It was run by a licensed therapist and involved about 6 other couples. One exercise involved discussing our family backgrounds and any traditions or expectations, spoken or unspoken, we might be bringing into the marriage. When it was our turn, Jamie talked about his family, middle class, suburban upbringing, fairly typical American holidays, importance placed on politeness and not making waves. He mentioned his German/Irish ancestry but framed it as history rather than active culture. Then he talked about our previous disagreement. He didn't shy away from it. He explained to the group how he had made assumptions about my identity based on my Indian heritage and how Maya had challenged him on the double standard applied to non-white Americans. He said, "I realized I was unconsciously viewing American as white, and Maya helped me see how problematic and hurtful that was. We had to have a tough conversation about respecting her identity as she defines it, which is American, and not imposing hyphenated labels or cultural expectations." I then spoke, reinforcing what he said and adding my perspective on growing up as a second-generation American, navigating the space between my parents' origins and my own lived experience. I mentioned the importance of raising our future children with a clear sense of belonging as Americans, while allowing them the space to explore other parts of their heritage if they wished. The therapist facilitated the discussion well, and some other couples shared their own experiences with differing backgrounds, religious, regional, socioeconomic. It felt productive. Jamie didn't just repeat what we discussed privately, he articulated the core issue, the white default, the hyphenation, the need to let individuals self-identify, in a public setting. It showed me he had truly integrated the understanding, not just offered a quick fix apology months ago. We also had a slightly awkward but ultimately okay interaction with his parents, Carol and Tom, shortly after the workshop. We met them for brunch. Carol, perhaps trying too hard to show she'd taken our conversation to heart, started asking very cautiously if certain foods we were ordering were too spicy for me or if I preferred milder options, things she'd never asked before. It was a bit clumsy, but Jamie handled it smoothly. He just said, "Mom, Maya likes spicy food just fine. Remember her dad's chili?" She seemed relieved and dropped the subject. It showed they were thinking about it, even if their execution was imperfect. It felt better than them ignoring the issue entirely. The workshop and these small interactions have helped solidify that we are moving forward on the same page. We're communicating better and more proactively addressing potential points of friction related to identity and background. The wedding planning feels less fraught now, more focused on the practicalities and the excitement of the day itself.